Well, I thought I was very clever when we prepared the announcement for tonight's meeting by carefully writing it so that it wouldn't be clear who was going to win, since we didn't know at the time that those announcements went out. So now we do know, and since this is a program about economics, I am not going to talk about all the other dimensions of what happened in the vote and Trump's victory. I'm going to talk about the economic dimension. That's not because I don't think the others are relevant and have a role to play, but it's because the economic one is getting less attention than I think it ought to, and I, for one, happen to believe it's a very important part of this story, and likely to get lost if we don't demand that people pay some attention to it. Okay. What is the economics of what just happened? Well, let's go from the superficial then and get deeper. The estimates of what Mrs. Clinton spent, both of the money raised by the campaign and by associated groups, is somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion, possibly a bit more. The amount of money spent by Trump is less than half of that. So let that sink in. Trump is a novice to political activity. He really doesn't know much about political operations. He's not married to a person who has been through this once before and knows exactly how the game is played. Mrs. Clinton had every conceivable advantage, knowing how the system works, working at it for all these years from a position of enormous power, either as the president's wife or as senator here from New York. She had all the contacts, all the relationships, all the IOUs that she had built up by helping everybody else. Trump didn't. She could present herself as reasonable and present him as a lunatic, and he couldn't play that game in reverse. So with the most money, the most connections, the most experience, and the most IOUs from the political system, she was defeated. And so the first thing I have to suggest to you is that the economics of running for office, all of which were in her favor, weren't enough to overcome something else that was pushing against her. And I want to ask and answer with you what that something else might have been. And the preponderance of the media, the big businesses in our country, were also on her side, with many examples of newspapers and so on that normally endorse Republicans, choosing this time not to do that, but to support her. I'm not aware of a single example of the other way. So she had the money, she had the history, she had the experience, she had the connections, and she had the media. And she was defeated. This is an extraordinary in American politics, just already at that level. The next, take it a little bit deeper. As best I can tell, and I'm looking at the same materials that all of you are that are trying to figure out what happened. As best I can tell, Mrs. Clinton made a conscious decision, with her advisors, I presume, to associate herself with Barack Obama, to associate herself with the prior regime of her husband, Bill Clinton, and therefore to embrace, not walk away from, the notion that she would be more of the same. Oh yes, a little different here and there, but even the differences kind of had to be squeezed out of her by Bernie Sanders' critiques from the left, and one would wonder whether she would have even made those relatively modest moves, criticizing the TPP and so on, had it not been for the extraordinary success of Bernie Sanders' effort. So she was more of the same. And Trump was a big, fat difference. I don't mean that quite the way it sounded, but I'm okay with it anyway. He made a big difference. He was new, he was different. He wasn't a career politician. He'd never been in any office before. He wasn't hooked up. In fact, the Republican Party in which he ran had an awful lot of people who said very nasty things about him Week after week and month after month, he was not well connected, didn't have any IOUs. You get the picture. He had one thing going for him. He was something new, something different. And his appeal, I would argue to you, to the American people, was exactly that. I am an outsider from the political game, and I bring you a big change. And I want you to have hope that the big change I bring will be to your benefit. And if you picked up the words hope and change, they should remind you of something. That 8 years ago, this game exactly was played in reverse. Then we had a sitting president, Mr. Bush, who was represented as part of an old family. He was the son, the father had been there before. It's kind of close to the husband had been there before. The father, the Bush family, governor of Texas, it was more of the same. And Obama came in and said, vote for me because I am different. He didn't have to explain that a lot. One look at him and you knew he was different from anything this country had ever voted into high office like that before, because he was black. So he didn't have to make a big thing about his difference. That was clear. He was different, and he was bringing hope and change. And you know, if you go back earlier, lots of politicians running for president for the last 30 years have argued, I'm an outsider, I'm not really part of the Beltway, I am change, I am different, I am new, I won't do to you what has been done to you for the last 35 years. And let me now take it another level. What is it that has happened to people over 35 years as they kept voting for somebody who was an outsider and who was different and who would bring hope and change? The big word here is change. This was kept going on, and it was promised. And meanwhile, over the last 30 to 40 years, what do we know economically? The gap between rich and poor in this country widened literally every year. The level of wages went absolutely nowhere. No increase in wages. The only way to increase your standard of living was either to make more people in the household go out and work, which a lot of families did, or to borrow money like there's no tomorrow, and then to develop all the anxieties with worrying whether you can repay all these loans. Which means the working class became further distant from the rich and powerful, became more and more money-driven, more and more anxious about their economic situation. Every statistic shows pensions down in terms of what confidence you can have when you get old. Benefits down. Job security down. Benefits of all kinds down. Public services cut back, particularly after 2008, when the economic crash bankrupted cities and towns, and they were cutting back on teachers and road maintenance and everything we now talk about as the need to redo our infrastructure. So for 40 years, the American mass of working people feeling their conditions shrinking, being squeezed, deteriorating. For the young people, it's the explosion over the last 30 years of an enormous overhang of debt in order to get a college education, at the same time that reality teaches them that a college education is less of a guarantee for a good job and a good income than it ever was. You're borrowing like crazy for something that's deteriorating in value as you accumulate the debts to buy it. That's going to eat at you, whether you're conscious of it or not. And the families that are trying to help those kids get through school, themselves going into debt. There's this wonderful statistic over the last 20 years that student debt has risen faster than every other kind and has now surpassed credit card debt. That is, the total amount of money borrowed for students is greater than the total amount of money borrowed by the entire population for credit card usage. But the mystery dissolves once you discover that because the student debt is cheaper than the credit card debt, Millions and millions of American families arranged for their students to borrow the money ostensibly for the school, but it's actually a substitute for the credit card debt because it doesn't carry as high an interest rate. People are rational and figured that out. So you have 30 to 40 years of deterioration. Of course, the American people are looking for something to change. What's going on, the fixed story, is getting worse and worse. Nor does it seem to matter whether there's a Republican in the president's seat or a Democrat. The rate of change in a bad direction may change, but the direction doesn't change. It's just the rate. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So more and more, the mass of people turn to somebody who's different. The horrible legacies of racism in this country were, in a peculiar way, overcome when millions of white workers in 2008 crossed that divide and voted Obama into office. Many of those people, it's one of the results of checking the counties in the Midwest of the United States, many of those people who voted for Obama in 2008 voted for Trump this time. That's not about racism. We know that because of what those people did 8 years ago. And they saw that Obama was different, and they hoped for change. But they didn't get it. Obama didn't deliver hope and change. Neither did any of the others that preceded him. And so there was a deepening sense in the American people, and why shouldn't there be? A sense of betrayal. One after another of these clowns, Republican, Democrat, white by and large, and now one black, promising that as outsiders, as different, as new, as committed, and then nothing fundamentally changes. I don't want to pick on Obama, but he's the last one of the last 8 years, so we have to tell the story. Inequality is worse than it was 8 years ago in this country. The wars he promised to end, we're still fighting in 5 countries, if not more, even ones that we weren't at the time that he became president. The tension with Russia, for those of you who pay attention, is scary. NATO has an alert. The troops are massing in that part of the European theater where this would have... Countries in Europe are scared because if there's trouble, it'll be fought there, not here, et cetera, et cetera. So where's the change? The job situation isn't improving. For those of you who watch the statistics and you read that unemployment is down, I've gone through this. I'll do it one more time. There are 2 things to keep in mind. First, at least half of the improvement is not because people without work got jobs. It's because people without work stopped looking for jobs. And when you stop looking, the government does not count you as unemployed. To be counted as an unemployed person in the United States, the way the government does this, and it's always done it, it's not a new thing, is it asks you, are you working? If you answer yes, I'm working, you're employed. If you answer no, I'm not working, you are asked the second question. Are you looking for work? If you answer yes, you're counted as an unemployed person. If you answer no, you're not considered to be in the labor force, and you're not counted. Which means if millions of people, and this is what has happened in the last 10 years, if millions of people who have no job stop looking for it, give up, unemployment goes down because they're no longer considered the unemployed. Half of the improvement since the depths of 2009 and 10 is that story. The other half is people who are getting a job, but it's a part-time job, and or it's a job at much lower pay, much fewer benefits, et cetera, than the job they once had. Therefore, the deterioration of their life continues because they've gone from a good, secure job to a crappy, insecure job, and they know it as deeply as if they were unemployed. There's no escaping from it. Okay, so now we have the latest one to come. Mr. Trump. How does he show he's different? Well, he sure doesn't show it with his wealth. He's ostentatious, he's a billionaire, can't do it that way. His way of doing it, he can't show his skin color. It's the Caucasian variety, as best I can tell. He's creative with color, as you can tell, so I don't know. But I'm guessing. So how is he going to be different? And the answer is, he's got to be, in some obvious way, outrageous, crazy, wild, extreme. He's got to show you that there's some reason for you to believe that he's a change, that he's different. He does it first with the Republicans, remember? All the people who had more money than him to begin with and much more credentials. Bush, the governor of Florida, and some of the others. He savaged them. He called them nasty names. He violated all the rules of political protocol. He had clever one-liners that we all remember, that were put-downs, plays on their physical qualities, on their mental qualities, on whatever he could imagine. And of course, you know, whatever he attacked in them, he made sure we all understood was large and abundant in him. If you need that explained to you, I can't do that in public, but you can guess. Okay? By the way, there's an analogy to what Trump did to the Republicans. There was a person on the other side who was also different. Sanders comes out of nowhere. A tiny state, no disrespect to my viewers in Vermont, a tiny state with 2 senators and 1 representative at last I looked. The only man in the Senate who calls it, I believe the only one, who calls himself an independent, and certainly the only one who accepts the label socialist, a kind of instant political suicide in America for the last half century. He steps forward and talks all the kinds of things that everybody understands that's a change. He gets up and he says, I will attack the big banks. I will attack the big corporations. They're the problem. They don't like me, and they're right. They shouldn't, because I am going to get them. But wow. Politician, that's new and that's different. The Democratic Party establishment believed that he would get 2 to 3% of the vote. The same threat they felt that they faced with Jill Stein. Tiny percentage wouldn't make enough of a difference. They completely misunderstood the situation. Before it was over, he came real close. If I have the numbers right, 13 million people in the primaries voted for Bernie Sanders. He defeated her in a number of contest states. That should have been a sign. The people who can make the case, I'm different, is almost all you have to do, and suddenly politics changes. Clinton was just barely able to suppress the challenge to her as more of the same from Mr. Sanders, who was different. But she didn't learn the lesson. She then had to discover that what Trump did to the Republicans, he could do to her, because he could see from the Bernie Sanders how vulnerable to this she was. She was more of the same to a population that had no tolerance for that at all. A population that wants higher wages, not lower. More job security, not less. More benefits at work, not fewer. More free public higher education, not more debts, etc., etc. Not more war, less war. Not more cuts in public services, more public services. Overwhelming in the country. So what happened? Mr. Trump was able to present himself as a better bet for change than Mrs. Clinton, which wasn't difficult. She made it relatively easy. This wasn't an election about Mr. Trump's horrific behavior about women or about immigrants. It was about basic change. I'm going to make it happen for you. You've been left out, you've been left behind, you've been betrayed repeatedly by these Republicans and Democrats. I'm something different. I'm not scrounging around for money the way the Clintons do. I don't need it. I already have it. Vote for me. I'm less corruptible than them because I corrupted myself earlier and have more money. I don't need to do it now at your expense. I already took care of that by generations of tenants, if you know his history and his family's history, much of it here in New York. So here we have an election in which the American people, in large numbers, vote for change. They're not voting for Mr. Trump's policies. Nobody has any clear idea what they are, him included. We could get into long discourses about the policies we think he may endorse. But that was smart of him. Don't get into that. Don't get yourself confused with the details that most people don't pay attention to anyway. People who are betrayed over and over again in politics, you know what they do? They turn off. They don't pay attention to these races until the last 2 weeks when they kind of begin to notice by the flood of information, oh yes, that's coming up, what am I going to do? And then they make a judgment based on a general notion that comes out of their lives. And they voted for Mr. Trump. Well, what can we say about it? A number of things. First, the liberals, the Clinton liberals, and indeed lots of liberals, they made the following mistake over the last 30 years, which they never admit. I don't think they'll admit it now either. They thought they could make themselves in power forever by saying to the mass of people, vote for us because we are not going to do it to you as badly as those Republicans do. Vote for us. We're not as bad as that. They're going to really sock it to you. We won't. We won't sock it to you that much. The deterioration you're suffering will slow down. We'll give you some offsets. We'll do a few things to make the downturns less painful. And that's all we have to do. We don't need to be left-wing Democrats, the New Deal, what came out of the coalitions of the 1930s. We don't have to. We got rid of those. That's the new center of the Democratic Party that was represented by the Clintons and all the people they gathered around them. We don't need that anymore. It's not necessary. The American people will choose between Republicans who are really going to stick it to the mass of working people and we who won't stick it that badly, or at least not that quickly. That's enough. We'll win. Sometimes it worked. Typically when it worked, the Democrats, the liberals who got into office, quickly discovered that they neither could nor would, nor in many cases even wanted to make any of the basic changes. They didn't think they had to. The problem was the mass of people became more and more disengaged from them because they didn't. They were convinced that the mass of people had nowhere else to go. I mean, either Democrat, which isn't so bad, or Republican, which is worse. So as long as you're a little bit better than the Republicans, you win. You get all their votes. You don't. Because what you're doing is you're creating in your own ranks a mass of people who, if they see a chance for something that might really change, will go there. Those are the people who voted for Obama 8 years ago and voted for Trump yesterday. They didn't think about it. They didn't think it was necessary. And they took the Democratic Party down an ever-worsening dead end. And Obama didn't learn the lesson either. Not that anybody else did. I don't want to pick on him, but he didn't learn it either. And what did the Republicans figure out? They figured out we've got a perfect game here. We're going to appeal to all the social conservatives, you know, people for whom religion is a very important, fundamentalist type of religion is very important, people for whom Abortion is murder, and all of that. You all know that. You don't need me to tell you about that. The Republicans will go after them. It will make an alliance, which it did, between those people and everybody in this society who can be convinced that the biggest danger to you is the government. Not your employer, not the company that provides you with the food and clothing that you wear, that is killing you. Not the companies, not the corporate culture, not the economy, the politicians. The government is the bad thing. And we Republicans are going to squash the government, reduce the government, limit the government, get the government off your back. And in this building of a coalition of the anti-government mentality and the social conservatives, the Republicans always had an enormous assist. And the enormous assist comes, sad to say, from the academic intelligentsia of the United States, which lives in this world of a good citizen and a bad government and will not give it up for anything. That's why Americans who lose their job when an employer fires them immediately become angry at the senator who didn't even know it happened, who's got absolutely nothing to do with it. The people who are pushed out of their home because they can't cover their mortgages are angry at the mayor or the congressperson. What? What a wonderful thing for capitalism. You kick the people and they're angry at somebody else. You kick them again, they're more angry at somebody else. They get so angry they vote them out and bring in the next one who does the same thing. The Republicans get that. Attack the government, gather the social conservatives, and the last leg, that's all it is, 3 steps. Pander to corporations and the rich. Cut their taxes, give them every benefit, deregulate them. And when the conditions of the mass of people get worse, you blame the government. Or the loss of Christian values. That solves your problem and brings together your coalition. They thought they had that made. That was a recipe that worked for them over and over. It worked for Bush. It works for Rubio, who got reelected. It works for Ted Cruz. They're specialists in all of this. Trump made them look ridiculous. It didn't work. He was too much of a change, and they were too caught up in this old Republican game that people feel betrayed by. Yes, conservatives feel betrayed too. That's why they abandoned Mr. Cruz and his preacher father. They abandoned Mr. Rubio. I don't have the adequate words to describe his virtues, and then again, it would be a short conversation. But in the case of Mr. Trump, here he is. I'm different. I'm not like these people. For a population that's betrayed and bitter, that's gone through 30 years of decline with nothing coming down the pike to indicate one whit of improvement, any change is acceptable. And Mr. Trump wasn't scary for most of them, because they don't find any of this relevant, mostly, to their lives. Well, is it all bleak? Some of your faces suggest that you think so. Let me tell you why I don't think so, okay? Mr. Trump will be no more able to change the basic conditions of the capitalism that afflicts the American people than any of his predecessors were. Not one bit. There's nothing in his history, nothing in his programs that indicate. Could he develop it? Sure, I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can. But why anyone in their right mind should imagine that this man, by virtue of his election, is going to raise wages where they've been falling, improve job security where it has been declining, get the students out of their debts? Stop. Nothing. There's no reason to expect any of it. Which means that Mr. Trump is setting himself up for exactly the same betrayal that people feel about Obama and about all the people before Obama. He's in line to do the same thing. There are wisecracking Democrats in Washington, the few that have a sense of humor, who are telling the Clintons, it's good that you lost, because the economic downturn that's coming, and I'm going to talk to you more about that, is now going to be his problem. It would have been your problem. And the truth of it is, these Democrats know the Clintons haven't a better clue what to do than does Mr. Trump. So the irony is, here is also an opportunity for what? Well, the candidate who comes out best at the end of all this carnage, all the nasty things Clinton said about Trump, all the nasty things Trump said about Clinton. You know who looks whiter than white, if I can abuse the metaphor? Bernie Sanders. There's nothing that's clinging to him that looks or smells like what clings to the others. He looks wonderful. He comes out clean. That's a very important thing, because that lesson is slowly percolating through the culture. And it carries implications that are going to be played out in the months and years ahead. Here's the second opportunity. It's possible for us, and by here I mean the broad left, and I don't usually talk like that because the broad left, for most of there's no symbolism involved here. There's none. Purely electronic event. He's not president yet. We have a chance as a left, now that we are much larger and know ourselves to be larger, now that we have shown that 13 million Americans will vote for somebody who says, yeah, I'm a socialist. Granted, he's the most moderate socialist one can imagine. Although there are now Europeans trying to out-moderate him. And succeeding. The French come to mind right away, but we'll come back to that. There is now, I think, an opportunity to say, if the left can get its act together, that the problem here is a capitalism that has been no good for the majority of people for 40 years. That's our problem. Changing our leaders has made no major difference in that basic story. So changing them again, from an Obama to a Trump, or from a Trump to whoever the next one is, that's not a solution. We don't have to make that case. That's not very hard to make. People already get that. That'll be easy. Well, then what do? We've got to change the economic system so it isn't driven by huge wealthy corporations that have the incentive and the resources to keep moving in the direction that has produced the deterioration for the last 40 years. And it's a very easy deterioration to describe. It's automation and it's relocation. Those are two words. Replacing workers with machines, above all the computer, and now the computerized robot. That's one. And moving production to cheap wage countries around the world is number two. There go the jobs, there goes the ability of the working class to get a decent standard of living, there goes a decline that is everywhere visible. And if it hasn't hit you personally yet, it will. There it is. And that's not going to be changed until you reorganize the decision-making apparatus. The decision to move a plant from here to there. The decision to destroy these jobs and replace them with robots and tell the people whose jobs have been replaced, you're on your own, get lost, go work, become a greeter at Walmart if you're lucky, or flip hamburgers. That's it, you're done. This society has no obligation towards you, no place for you, no understanding of what the impacts on your family, friends, neighbors, none of it. We're free to screw you every which way, as we have been doing. An alternative to that, an economic system built in a different way, giving the power of making these decisions to the mass of people and not to private capital, that's our only way out of this. If we do it, we build the basis for what? We build the basis for a new political party. Because such a movement to change the economy has to have a political expression. It has to have an agency that goes around and explains to everybody else what it's doing and why it's doing it. Because the support will be there if we do it. This will be a political party whose goal is to reduce the footprint of capitalism in our economy and to raise the footprint of an alternative system, which you can call worker co-ops, which I do, or worker self-directed enterprises, or a different way of organizing production so that people together democratically decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. That solves our problems, and you need a political party that will advocate for that kind of change. And by doing that, we'll show that the Republicans and Democrats are advocates for the continuation of capitalism. They just differ on exactly how to do it. The Republicans more aggressive and stick it to the working class, the Democrats not as bad. But two parties that are two wings of the same economic commitment means you don't have any real choice unless another party comes along, which is another argument for its emergence. We are strong enough to do that now. Occupy showed us a beginning. Bernie showed us an enormous step forward. I'm very impressed in recent weeks that the Black Lives Matter movement is taking more and more interest in these economic questions and taking position. So there's another leg, signs. And all of this amidst the deterioration of capitalism, which is what I'm going to turn to for the rest of my talk. But we have an opportunity here. It is not just a defeat. The biggest defeat suffered here is by the establishments of the two major parties who really have taken it on the chin. It's their own fault. I'm not asking any of you to have any sympathy with them at all. They don't deserve it. They eagerly pushed every critical impulse out. Eagerly. For them, the left has been irrelevant, marginal, dismissible, contemptible. That's how they react. Nor do I think this Trump defeat of them will teach them much. I think they're beyond it. They've been doing this for too long. They're too deep into this rut. They're going to continue doing it. And as I begin to read the interpretations of Trump's victory, you can already see how they're interpreting it as being, we're not going to give it up. For example, the interpretation, this is all about racism, or this is all about immigration, or this is all about grabbing women's genitals. Horrible as all those parts of this game were, they're not what this game is fundamentally about. And it's a mistake to go in that direction because it loses us the sense of where we can go to change this.